one of the things that's powerful about the risk-based approach is that it allows you to find just those areas where your risk is highest and go deep and go below the level of materiality. Something that you couldn't do if you tried to canvass every entity.
I think that's right. Not just do it only in those areas, but do it in a deep and meaningful way so that you are looking into transactional detail. You're taking meaningful samples. You're talking to people in those operations. In the lower risk areas, you can take another approach. You can handle things through a questionnaire. You can do employee surveys. But where you focus your efforts is really in the highest risk areas. Another thing you can do in the high risk areas is to identify the vendors, the third parties who you're dealing with, and do additional due diligence as to those vendors, and also have higher level requirements in terms of the approvals in dealing with those third parties, because that's where the bulk of the risk really is, at least in the bribery context. Here's one thing that I think will become an expectation, because increasingly there's an appreciation that third parties are where you're going to get in trouble in the anti-bribery area, whether you're talking about vendors, whether you're talking about agents or consultants. I saw a statistic last year that some 90% of FCPA bribery cases originate with a third party. While obviously the third parties may work for you, but you don't work with them, you don't have a sense as to how they're conducting themselves.
They're called third parties for a reason.
For a reason, that's right. And I think there was always a sense that there was a little bit more, there was some distance from that transaction, so you didn't have to scrutinize it quite as much. Well, now we know that that is what gets you into more trouble. A lot of these contracts now have right to audit clauses, because that's an expectation that you would have that in there in the event there was something that came to light with this third-party vendor.
In fact, on that point, SEC representatives at conferences have said, why would you treat a vendor any different than your company? If they're representing you somewhere, why wouldn't you audit them just like you would audit yourself? Again, be mindful and use the risk-based approach, but still exercise your audit rights, because that's where the risk is.
And there's no question. I mean, that has evolved over the last several years and continues to evolve to the point, as you say, Sulaksh, where the expectation is now that a third party is almost synonymous with your own employee, and you're expected to be responsible for their conduct when they're operating on your behalf.
Now, Matt, what's your view on this? My experience is when we've done risk assessments for clients or helped them with it, there's always one or two areas that come up that the client hadn't even considered was an FCPA risk. Do you see the same?
Yes, there's always some area that isn't appreciated, at least to the level that that I would think that it should be appreciated. And it may be a matter of this is something that's handled outside of the usual compliance function. An example would be customs. Customs is often handled by the people who manage logistics, and there might be a trade office that deals with everything in the customs arena. That may not be appreciated the same way. Additionally, whenever you have a third-party vendor, this person or entity may have been dealing with whatever the function has been handled for years and years and years. They've never had a problem, so they don't appreciate the problem or the need to audit. And why would you audit somebody you've been dealing with for 35 years? And that's exactly somebody who you should audit.
Right. In fact, one counterintuitive risk factor or risk mitigating factor can be the fact that you've had a problem in an investigation in the recent past. Sometimes the organizations that have had a problem, investigated it appropriately, remediated, done all the training, are in fact, the lowest risk. And yet some risk assessments will rank them high because there's been, historical problems. So as the regulators continue to pursue these matters and really develop expertise in individual industries, the pharmaceutical industry is a great example. They are learning what is common practice from a compliance perspective in that particular industry. And then when they visit another company, they will undoubtedly be comparing practices to see if you're meeting the same level of your peers. Is that your experience?
That's right. And there's also a risk there for companies. They need to have an appreciation of what the regulators are aware of within their industry. Because one thing that will happen is if there is a bad vendor out there, if there's a third party who is getting into trouble repeatedly, and they work across the industry in a particular location, let's say it's the energy services area, and you have one particular vendor that is doing pipeline maintenance or something along those lines. They are winding up bribing officials. Well, one company could wind up using them and get in trouble with the regulators. But if this pipeline operator is working for any number of different companies, you can pretty well be assured that the SEC is going to send letters to each and every one of them.
Right.
So be aware of who you're working with and be aware as best you can of the problems that that third party is running into.
And how can a company effectively benchmark themselves to their peers from a compliance perspective?
We've actually seen companies come together in informal forums. So Transparency International is one entity which has an event called Corporate Council Forum where compliance officers of different companies come together. Sometimes it's by industry, sometimes it's by geography. And there is a closed-door discussion about what it is that they're facing in terms of risks and what it is that they're doing from a compliance perspective. So that's a great forum for companies to exchange information. But again, such forums are limited in terms of how often they happen.
So there's industry forums. That's a great way to share information. And I think there's also some, publications and surveys that talk about Compliance Weekly puts out an annual study that can help provide some guidance about what's reasonable and appropriate.
I think in terms of policies as well, your policies aren't static. They shouldn't be static. And aside from when you have something like this guidance that's recently come out in the last year or a DPA that provides a little bit additional guidance, every year you should do a survey of what your peer companies are doing in terms of updating their codes of conduct. One of the expectations that the regulators have is that you'll have dollar thresholds for entertainment and that things will have certain levels of approval. Well, it's helpful to look at what your peer companies have in place. And so if they have a $100 or a $50 threshold across all of your peers who are operating in a particular part of the world, and you're at 200 or 250, it should be pretty clear that you need to modify what you do and what you have in place because you're the outlier.
And a good example of that is, with the guidance coming out, the guidance talks about 4 or 5 factors to consider before making any charitable contributions. Right? So that would be great for a company who hadn't factored in anything like that in their policies to pick those up and say, okay, we're going to modify our policies because here's a perfect example of what the DOJ expects and we're going to embed it in our policy.